A football team can rise to unforeseen glory in a competition with the lifespan of a handful of games. Denmark did it on little to no preparation in 1992. Greece shocked the world 12 years after that, and the FA Cup has been blessed with its stunning denouements from the likes of Sunderland, Southampton and Wimbledon as they overcome the might of Leeds, Manchester United and Liverpool. But to do so over the breadth of a full league season is taking something spectacular and turn it into rarefied air. Unfancied teams from time to time do win the league. Teams like Ipswich Town and Nottingham Forest manage as much in the 1960s and 70s in England immediately after promotion. On the continent, clubs like Kaiserslautern and Hellas Verona have revelled in championship successes. But Leicester City's class of 2016 was different. This was the era where any form of success was narrowed down to the exclusive club of a select few, where the wage bill number predicated the league table, where Leicester was supposed to be relegated after a belated run of form that retained their top-flight status by the smallest of margins. They lost their manager, their best player, and signed a manager everybody believed to be washed up and players who nobody knew. Favourites for the drop, instead they won the league. This film explains the utter madness of Leicester City's league title win of 2016 and the 7-year rollercoaster since. Leicester City first dipped their toe into the top flight of English football in 1908, found the waters to be a little bit too hot as they conceded 102 goals and quickly they retreated. More successful times would be in the days of Arthur Chandler in the 1920s, where the club threatened the elite teams of their day, Everton, Huddersfield Town and Sheffield Wednesday. 5 visits to Wembley, including the club's first major trophy in 1964 with the League Cup, followed in a more prosperous 12-year stint in the top division. After relegation in 1969, Leicester made do with cameo roles in the top tier, which included a first taste of the Premier League in 1994. This, however, would be more akin to their first go at top-level English football of the 1900s than any form of success, as they were immediately sent back down. With the appointment of former Nottingham Forest European Cup winner Martin O'Neill, the Foxes were soon prowling the turf of the Premier League once more, swiftly returning in 1996. It was the club's most successful venture yet. 4 successive top-half finishes, 3 League Cup finals that included 2 winners' medals in 1997 over Middlesbrough and in 2000 over Tranmere Rovers. In the rigid days of the 4-4-2, teams who veered away from the norm were rewarded. The dominant club of its day, Manchester United, dropped Eric Cantona between the lines, whilst Leicester City's variant maintained the wing play of their contemporaries, but they packed out the midfield in a 3-5-2. The points tallies of 47, 49, 53 and 55 broke one club record after another. But it couldn't last, as Martin O'Neill was swayed by the greener grass of Celtic up north. Rudderless without him, Leicester became a desperate yo-yo club, swinging violently from one state to another, with 2 relegations sandwiched by a promotion. For the first time in the club's history, later on they played in the 3rd tier upon their relegation to League One in 2008. They'd earned promotion straight back and earned a playoff spot to return to the Premier League in 2010, but their journey on the long road back only started later that year. In August 2010, Vichai Zivai Hadaprada made do on a 13-year interest as he bought Leicester City for £40 million. As one of Thailand's richest people, the first football match he saw was the Foxes' 1997 League Cup triumph. A decade and then some later, his fortune had risen into the billions after earning the contract for duty-free stores in major airports across Southeast Asia. Close allies with a disgraced Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, Vichai only survived a purge in his own country himself thanks to the relationship he had with the royal family. His charitable work, as well as the intelligent playing of both anti- and pro-Thaksin sides back home, helped him remain prominent in Asia, and helped him achieve what only Shinawatra could dream of in football, as his association with Manchester City ended after just a year. Vichai's with Leicester would blossom into a brilliant 8-year marriage. After the appointment of former England coach Sven-Göran Eriksson had soured, the investment from Thailand came under sharp scrutiny. This was a post-Abramovich world where supporters would be reticent to confess it, but it was a time in history where money from a foreign land would be knee-jerkingly greeted by misplaced optimism for an Abramovich-type spend. Since, the delirium had been replaced by immense suspicion. Carson Young of Hong Kong had recently been arrested and plunged Birmingham City into uncertainty. Vincent Tan of Malaysia was the Cardiff City owner who might have returned them to the top flight, but at what cost? The traditional blue shirts had been replaced by red, with the club's history dramatically shunned. The Venkis of India had spiralled Blackburn Rovers into crisis that ended with Premier League relegation, but not before fan protests saw to a pitch invasion from a live chicken. And then there was Thaksin Shinawatra himself, who had promised Manchester City newfound riches, also employed Sven-Göran Eriksson, but returned to mid-table mediocrity before his assets were frozen. It wouldn't take long for those suspicions, though, to be banished. Boosted by a prolific amount of work in the community, writing off over £100 million worth of debt, as well as the reappointment of Hull City manager Nigel Pearson, Leicester smashed through the 100-point barrier in the Championship, and Vichai had won the fans over. After 11 years away, Leicester City were back in the big time and armed with an ownership and coaching staff that gave them a chance of staying in the division. In a series of astute signings, the experience of Matthew Upson was paired off with Aston Villa's Mark Albrighton, Brighton's Leonardo Ulloa and QPR's Danny Simpson of the English leagues before Esteban Cambiasso was stunningly acquired on a free transfer. There was early promise, points taken from Everton and Arsenal in home draws at the King Power before all three was gained from the Britannia against a Stoke City team that had become a Premier League staple in Leicester's absence. The following week was Leicester's headline result of the season, a 5-3 victory over Manchester United after coming back from 2 goals down. It was the game where Jamie Vardy's qualities up front were first showcased to the masses of a Premier League audience, and where Esteban Cambiasso netted his first Leicester goal. They wouldn't win for another 3 months. Mark Schwarzer, Robert Hoof and Andrej Kramaric were all brought in as Leicester scrambled for a foothold in the relentless division. Rock bottom would be a position Leicester found themselves in until mid-April when, suddenly, Leicester's form took a surge in momentum. Unfortunate to be on the wrong end of a 4-3 defeat at White Hart Lane, Leicester retooled after the international break to sneak an increasingly dramatic late wins against West Ham and West Brom before Swansea and Burnley fell. The victory at Turf Moor, whilst harming a relegation rival, also served to lift Leicester out of the drop zone for the first time since November the 22nd. 140 days Leicester were bottom 4, and thanks to 10 points from their final 4 games, it was a record amount of time for a non-relegated club to be in such a position. The catalyst for such a dramatic change was Nigel Pearson. A strange man, really. He could be found on the touchline on all fours jokingly, yet at the same time so menacingly, pretending to choke out opposition players. If he wasn't up to those crazy hijinks, he'd be calling out journalists as ostriches. Still, his regimented football had taken Leicester up, and his ability to adapt by utilising a 3-man defence a full 18 months before the country salivated over Antonio Conte, that was the thing that kept Leicester up. The escape was formed off the back of the back 3. 4 wins from 29 matches were achieved with the back 4, whilst 22 points from an available 27 was acquired with the defensive 3. His main charges all came from very different backgrounds. You had Jamie Vardy, a forward who completely shunned football for 7 months after his release from Sheffield Wednesday, until he returned to play semi-professionally for Stockbridge Steels. 29 goals in 41 games at the newly rechristened FC Halifax Town earned him a move up the ladder to 5th tier Fleetwood Town before an even better goal rate saw Leicester's £1 million punt on the Englishman. There he met Danny Drinkwater, who was a Manchester United Academy dropout and from a completely different world in a footballing sense. Leicester was viewed as just another club on his seemingly endless middling Football League career that took on stints at Huddersfield Town, Cardiff City, Watford and Barnsley before a 2012 permanent move from Old Trafford without playing a competitive game. Completing a devastating trident was Riyad Mahrez. From the lower reaches of the French leagues, the Algerian was plucked from obscurity and placed into the Championship. While Steve Walsh was scouting a teammate at Le Havre, he honed in on Mahrez, who was signed 5 months out from Leicester's promotion for just £450,000. By the time of the Premier League season, he had become accustomed to the English game and was ready to hit the ground running for what was earmarked as a difficult second season in the top flight. Not joining them was Nigel Pearson. An overwhelming majority of 70% of supporters that were polled were of the opinion that the decision was the wrong one. Ultimately, Pearson wasn't sacked for footballing reasons, but due to fundamental differences with the ownership that stemmed from a post-season trip to Thailand. There, several reserve players, that included the manager's son, engaged in a racially abusive orgy. With Nigel Pearson's position now untenable, Leicester City had to find somebody else. Claudio Ranieri was no stranger to English shores. A former player of Roma and Palermo, he most notably earned his stripes at lower league side Catanzaro, before a string of successes in the 90s in his Italian homeland beached him in the Premier League. Formerly of Cagliari and Napoli, Ranieri shot to fame as coach of Fiorentina, returning La Viola immediately back to Serie A and forming the basis of their success at the turn of the millennium with the 1996 winning of the Coppa Italia. He was then courted by Spain and Valencia, where he also grabbed the National Cup, the Copa del Rey, and finally qualified the great club for the Champions League. He would not be around to bask in such glories, however, as he moved to Atletico Madrid under the volatile Jesus Gil. Only then did Ranieri find Chelsea, another strong cup team from West London in England. His 4 years, though, at Stamford Bridge were bittersweet. It was widely accepted that he, alongside Chelsea predecessors Ruud Gullit and Gianluca Vialli, as well as Arsenal manager Arsene Wenger, were transforming English football for the better under more cosmopolitan European values. However, it didn't take long for him to be derided as Chelsea manager, in charge of what would often be the 5th or 6th wheel in a title race, behind the all-encompassing Manchester United and Arsenal, as well as the likes of Liverpool, Leeds and Newcastle. He was unfairly used as a punchline for his poor grasp of English and quickly became known as the Tinkerman for his proficiency of resting players. It was said that he helped introduce squad rotation to the English mainstream, even though long before he arrived, Sir Alex Ferguson had won the treble with Manchester United in 1999 by not naming an unchanged team throughout the entirety of the season. The modern-day thread that began with Gullit and Vialli at Stamford Bridge was expanded upon, and Ranieri returned Chelsea to where they felt they belonged, to FA Cup finals and Champions League qualifications. Ultimately, he would be unsuccessful. Ranieri ran into the big stumbling block of a double-winning Arsenal team at the Millennium Stadium in 2002's FA Cup final, and despite a second-place finish and Champions League semi-final appearance in 2004, was thwarted by an ownership change in West London. Roman Abramovich had the deepest pockets to afford any player or manager he desired, so he plucked the Champions League winning Jose Mourinho from Porto, and it was he and not Ranieri who took Chelsea to the new heights of a first league title in half a century. The Italian was of the same pragmatic school that was infiltrating top-level football of Rafa Benitez, Jose Mourinho and Carlo Ancelotti. Tactically astute, he could be attributed to the reimagining of Frank Lampard as a box-crashing midfielder as opposed to an attack-minded number 10. Ranieri returned to the continent to mixed results. First, he couldn't rekindle the same success at Valencia before a return home to Italy and to Parma, Juventus, Roma and Inter in quick succession, which did very little for his CV. A first stab at international management and a Greece side still rediscovering their place in the world after winning Euro 2004 was an unmitigated disaster. He wouldn't complete Euro 2016 qualifying, sacked in 2014 after losing to the Faroe Islands at home. Less than a year later, he was being paraded as the new Leicester City manager to a tepid response. The narrative of his appointment was largely driven by former player Gary Lineker's scathing one-word tweet, which read, "Really?" The pool of potential Leicester City managers was sparse. The experienced Gus Hiddink wasn't too keen on a return to the Premier League, whilst former coach Martin O'Neill was still encapsulated in the Irish national job. Meanwhile, O'Neill's former player, Neil Lennon, rose as one of the forerunners for the post, only to be outmuscled by Ranieri. There were very real fears of another vicious boom and bust cycle returning to the king power, reminiscent of the Sven-Göran Eriksson days. Claudio Ranieri was no longer a name that constituted the kind of positive reaction that Nigel Pearson's Great Escape had cultivated. The Italian had praised the Leicester City of the prior season for their fight against the odds, but claimed that better tactics needed to be installed. Crucially though, he retained some of the staff that made Pearson's great Leicester City escape possible. This included former Foxes player Steve Walsh, who was part-time assistant manager and part scout and head of recruitment, as well as the other assistant manager Craig Shakespeare. The club embarked on a pre-season tour of Austria, where the new manager was reticent to change much of anything, only to gradually introduce his ideas to his new players. He weaned the players off the defensive three that had tided the club over at the end of the previous season, with a reversion to a back four for each of the pre-season games' second halves. That was exactly how he would line up for Leicester's Premier League opener against Sunderland. The only signing that made it into Ranieri's starting 11 was the energetic pressing forward Shinji Okazaki. Meanwhile, Christian Fuchs and N'Golo Kante were eased in. Much like the signing of Mahrez from Le Havre, Kante was the brainchild of Steve Walsh, who pushed relentlessly to sign yet another player that nobody had heard of. The club was slowly getting results out of Mahrez. The industry of Vardy was now being found routinely by Drinkwater, and there was the trust that Walsh had got it right again with Kante. Irrespective of that, The Guardian predicted Leicester to finish 19th, an optimistic and probably piss-taking 0.53% of their polled online readers believed they'd win the league. That counts to an almighty 43 people. Alternatively, 51% of the poll had the Foxes tipped for relegation, with only Watford given worst odds by the audience, as 66% of them believed the Hornets would feel the sting of relegation in their first season back. The honest truth was that belief and trust in Claudio Ranieri had deteriorated because of his track record since Chelsea. Nobody truly thought that Esteban Cambiaso could be replaced after he decided not to renew his contract in July, a mere 8 days after Ranieri was hired. The 2015-16 season of Leicester City can be split into 3 stages. The first, like many seasons of the optimistic football fan, is being carefree. The new campaign was seen in with weeks of end-to-end thrillers where, in 4 of the Foxes' first 6 matches, Leicester fell behind but quickly found they could unlock deep defences. Sunderland were beaten on opening day before Ranieri masterminded Leicester's first win away in the capital since their return to the Premier League. The victory at Upton Park, only Leicester's second win at the ground since 1966, was a change in fortunes after Nigel Pearson had overseen 6 defeats in 6 league trips to London the previous year. It was Leicester's first 2-win start to a Premier League season since the days of Martin O'Neill, and they stretched an unbeaten away streak to 5 Premier League matches for the very first time, with a point gained at Bournemouth. Whilst Wes Morgan was struggling without the benefit of a pre-season thanks to his involvement in Jamaica's Copa America campaign in Chile, Leicester's defence was porous. Too many gaps were opening up between defence and midfield, as well as between the centre-halves and fullbacks. Ranieri's first options at fullback were Jeffrey Schlupp and Richard Delat, but were quickly rowed back on. Christian Fuchs agreed to sign for Leicester on a free transfer from Schalke. The 29-year-old came with a wealth of experience, notably in the Champions League and Bundesliga, but his acquisition was completed with Nigel Pearson as manager. With Claudio Ranieri in charge of pre-season, Fuchs earned precious few minutes on the pitch, and with no starts in the league in the first month, his Premier League career looked over before it begun. However, the Austrian eventually replaced Schlupp at left-back, who was viewed to be far more attacking. Fuchs alternatively was viewed as a conservative choice, an option for the sake of solidity. Meanwhile, Danny Simpson replaced the error-prone fellow Manchester United dropout Richard Delat. Simpson's own solidity combined with his distribution from out wide and lack of routine errors firmed up the defence. Ahead of him, Riyad Mahrez hit his stride with 5 goals and 3 assists from the first 7 league matches. It proved a strong foundation for an eventual PFA Player of the Year award. Completing the squad was N'Golo Kante, who was finally preferred to Gökhan Inler in September. Inler was marked by Ranieri as the natural successor to Cambiaso. Like Cambiaso, he was in his 30s, he came from Italy and benefited from vast experience. However, it was Kante that soon earned the nod ahead of him. A diminutive midfielder, Kante was initially mistaken for an academy player upon signing for the club. The Frenchman was finally trusted and he instantly repaid his team. Initially utilised out wide in a narrow 4-4-2, Kante was moved inside to a central position at half-time against Stoke City as Leicester stared down the barrel of a 2-0 defeat. With Kante's industry unlocked centrally, Leicester recovered to take a point thanks to the goals from Vardy and Mahrez. Ranieri never looked back, Kante simply had to play in the middle of the park. It wasn't long before he had become the number one name on the team sheet, drawing comparisons to compatriot Claude Makelele thanks to his defensive shielding abilities as well as his ball recoveries. But this was unfair. He was more mobile and much more aggressive than Makelele and literally covered every blade of grass, a relentlessness that birthed a million memes and made him the club's most important player. Leicester's carefree spirit was maintained through a second 2-goal comeback in the same month against Southampton before their shipping of 5 goals at home to Arsenal was banished against Norwich. Their triumph over Norwich City was viewed as a turning point where each of the characteristics of the team were all used at once for the first time. The backline of Schmeichel in net with the rigid flat-back four was locked in. Mark Albrighton had overcome personal difficulties in the off-season to hug the left touchline to devastating effect, whilst Mahrez could cut inside from the other flank. Kante made them tick, Drinkwater supplied the direct game, and simply put, Jamie Vardy was a complete nuisance, and whoever lined up alongside him, be it Shinji Okazaki or Leonardo Ulloa, would follow suit. Only 12 matches into the season did Leicester City gain their first clean sheet, and with that came the promise of pizza from Ranieri. This was Leicester still being their carefree best in the opening third of the season, but with the subtle method of demanding more control from his team, Leicester had earned their reward of pizza via a win at home to Crystal Palace. The Foxes might have been dumped out of the League Cup at the fourth round stage by Hull City, but the mood in the camp was lightened by a pizza-making workshop which intertwined team bonding with a carrot and stick approach to rewarding from their manager. Victory over Newcastle on November the 21st placed Leicester City at the top of the Premier League for the first time since October 2000. They were ready for their second stage, control. Albrighton creating on the left, Mahrez scoring on the right, and the energy of Vardy and Okazaki up front, Leicester had a lightning-quick front four that could spring into action. Necessitated by the defensive cover of Kante and Drinkwater, Leicester had taken the transitional groundwork learned under Nigel Pearson and took it to a completely new level. From a low block, low possession base, the front men would run the channels or on the shoulder of the defence, and opposition players didn't know what hit them. Leicester wouldn't lose a second match in the Premier League until Boxing Day, and they played the reigning champions Chelsea and eventual FA Cup winners Manchester United in this sequence. Against the latter, Jamie Vardy destroyed Ruud van Nistelrooy's consecutive goal record in Premier League matches, as well as becoming the Leicester player with the most goals in the division, and it wasn't even December yet. Vardy was flying. Named in the England squad in the past 2 breaks, he became only the 3rd Leicester City player to be named Premier League Player of the Month after Tim Flowers and Muzzy Izzet. He, alongside Riyad Mahrez, would become heavily touted to the quote-unquote bigger Premier League clubs in the build-up to January. Christmas delivered pizza galore after the clean sheets against both Spurs and Man City, as well as at home to Bournemouth. Further to that, Leicester City won at Goodison Park for the first time since 1985, thanks to a pair of Riyad Mahrez penalties. This placed the Foxes at the top of the table in time for Christmas. In doing so, they became only the 3rd club after Burnley in 1926 and Norwich in 1988 to lead the league on Christmas Day the year after they were bottom at the table at Christmas. And yet the question still remained: when will Leicester City begin their predictable demise? Starting 2016, only goal difference away from pole position, Leicester sandwiched in losing ventures in the FA Cup against Spurs with a more prosperous league victory against the side at White Hart Lane. A first win there since 1999 was teamed with the goal of the season from Jamie Vardy, as he rocketed in a 40-yard screamer in a 2-0 triumph over Liverpool. As February turned up at Leicester's doorstep, they led the league. The last team to not win the Premier League from such a position was Arsenal in 2003. Then came the 3rd and final stage of Leicester City's miraculous season, the awakening. The definitive sea change in perceptions of the Foxes came on February the 6th. Before the trip to the Etihad, people were almost salivating with the prospect that Leicester would soon spiral down the Premier League table and allow for a proper champion. Afterwards, however, people were now clueless as to who would stop the Foxes. This was the Premier League's awakening to Leicester's title bid, and the club itself would follow suit soon after. Robert Hoof's double and Mahrez sunk City, but Arsenal fought hard to extinguish any title flames 8 days later with a last gasp win at the Emirates over Leicester. Little did they know that this flame could not be put out. Just as the trip to Carrow Road had been a turning point earlier on in the season, Leonardo Ulloa ensured that the return fixture was too. He turned 1 point into 3 late on in the East Midlands 2 weeks later that resulted in celebrations that registered on the Richter scale. March was upon us, and despite a 2-2 draw at home to West Brom, Leicester turned into the title-winning machines, more akin to a Chelsea, Arsenal or Man United. Riyad Mahrez's goal beat Watford, Shinji Okazaki sunk Newcastle before the international break failed to stop Leicester's momentum. As club football returned, Mahrez returned to the score sheet at Selhurst Park, and Danny Drinkwater provided the winner at home to Southampton. 4 games, 4 1-0 wins, and the carefree attitude of autumn had become a tireless charging towards a Premier League title of spring. A 5th win in succession 7 days later at the Stadium of Light stretched Leicester's lead to 10 points with 5 games to play, and in spite of nearest challenger Tottenham's win over United, it had become a matter of when and not if Leicester would win the league. A run of 574 minutes without conceding a goal ended in the 34th match of the season against West Ham. Not even a draw or Jamie Vardy's controversial red card for simulation was a cause to stop the celebrations, thanks to the confirmation that little old Leicester would be participating in the Champions League thanks to a 95th minute Leonardo Ulloa equaliser. Jamie Vardy would be missing. Thankfully, his absence wasn't keenly felt, as Leicester's 4-0 thrashing of Swansea City proved a perfect moment, the perfect assist for the clinching of the league title the week after at the home of the record English champions. But another draw with Manchester United, this time at Old Trafford, put celebrations on ice. Until the following day, at least, when the team gathered around Jamie Vardy's living room to witness the barbaric Battle of the Bridge. Tottenham played to type, becoming too emotional and too embroiled in a fight with neighbours Chelsea, throwing away a 2-goal lead to remove any doubt. Leicester City were now champions of England. They'd end the season with a 1-1 draw over the prior season's champions Chelsea, the 31-point gap between the pair, the biggest total ever in English football. And with that point, only Chelsea's 2005 vintage, as well as Arsenal's Invincibles and 2 Manchester United teams of the past, could boast a bigger winning margin of the Premier League than Leicester's. They hadn't luckily just scraped the title, they'd obliterated the entire field. But how did they do it? First of all, time to defuse the rumour that Claudio Ranieri was the Tinkerman. In the 36 matches before the Premier League was sealed, the Leicester manager named 15 unchanged Premier League teams with just 29 changes across the first 36 matches. The biggest portion of those were made either early on in the season or when Ranieri was selecting a strike partner for Vardy, with Okazaki and Ulloa sharing that duty. Admittedly, like with any title-winning team, a measure of luck does come into it. The luck for Leicester comes in the form of a gaping open window for them to sneak through in order to become champions. Managerial upheaval saw to Jose Mourinho's second tenure ending at Stamford Bridge in the Premier League's worst case of a title defence. Anfield saw a similar case, with Brendan Rodgers' surprise package Liverpool team of 18 months prior ended with a run of bad results and Jurgen Klopp's appointment. In Manchester, managers were living on borrowed time, as Manuel Pellegrini's position at the Etihad was passed over to the long-awaited arrival of Pep Guardiola in the Premier League. Meanwhile, Louis van Gaal's 2 years across town at Old Trafford was mercilessly brought to a close as he celebrated with the FA Cup trophy. Arsenal's Arsene Wenger had been on his last legs as a Premier League force for some years, whilst Mauricio Pochettino's Tottenham Hotspur were at an embryonic stage in comparison with their youthful squad. Tactically, as we've discussed, much has been derived from another underdog tale of the 2010s, Diego Simeone's Atletico Madrid. Both teams played with a stringent defensive four, with a much lower block and lower need for possession than their title rivals before stinging their opposition on the counter. Leicester's possession was only ahead of Tony Pulis's West Brom and Sam Allardyce's Sunderland, who finished 14th and 17th respectively. The Foxes relied on tackles and interceptions, the basis for their surge up the table, and ranked the highest for both metrics in the division. And whilst they did have a £55 million net spend over their first 2 seasons back in the top flight, it was dwarfed dramatically by the biggest spenders in the division, Manchester United, who spent almost 3 times more on transfers. Regardless of those numbers, the better barometer for success should be the wage bill. In that respect, the validity of Leicester City's success being a fairy tale is given more power thanks to the fact that their wage bill ranked in the bottom 5 of the division and was only a quarter that of reigning champions Chelsea, who finished in 10th. Leicester City had scaled the mountain, they'd conquered English football, and their horizons were soon to open up continent-wide. The question now was, could they go again? As with any squad that dares to have dreams and ambitions for what others might deem above their station, Leicester City didn't take long to have their contents ripped out. Kante and Drinkwater departed for Chelsea in successive summers. Mahrez spent a season sulking before his big move to Manchester City materialised. Vardy was on course to join them in the big leagues, only to turn down the offer of playing for Arsenal. Meanwhile, the man who many deemed to be the brains of the operation, former player as well as head of recruitment and joint assistant Steve Walsh, was picked up by Everton. You'd have thought that Claudio Ranieri, the very public figurehead of such an impossible sporting fairy tale, would have been given immunity from such a culling, yet he didn't last the subsequent season. With the club skirting dangerously close to the relegation zone come the spring of 2017, Ranieri was sacked in a Spanish airport after losing a Champions League knockout game away in Seville. The Foxes stood crippled, only a point and place above the drop, increasingly saddled with the danger of becoming the first post-war English team to be relegated as champions. Not since Manchester City of 1938 had an English champion suffered such a fate. Added to the poor results, none of Ranieri's signings had worked. The players sat restless, knocked from their perch, and Leicester's dream had died. Craig Shakespeare, one of the men who survived the transition from Pearson to Ranieri, was placed in caretaker charge. Suddenly, after 3 victories that culminated in qualification to the Champions League quarter-finals, he was named the permanent boss. The group stages of the Champions League had offered the club respite from domestic woes, with Riyad Mahrez awakened from his slumber with goals in half of the Foxes' European games before Christmas. They comfortably won their first Champions League tie away to Club Brugge, before new acquisition Islam Slimani scored one of only 13 goals in a Leicester shirt as the King Power celebrated the first match in the competition by defeating former champions Porto 1-0. 2 clean sheets against Copenhagen and a 4th win from 5 against Club Brugge confirmed Leicester's historic place in the knockouts as group winners with a game to spare. Only Barcelona, Atletico Madrid, Juventus, Arsenal and Borussia Dortmund could boast a better group record. After the penalty heroics of Kasper Schmeichel across 2 games against Sevilla and goals from Vardy, Morgan and Albrighton, Leicester were handed a quarter-final fixture with Atletico Madrid. This time the penalties went against the English side, as Antoine Griezmann's controversial spot kick gave Atletico a narrow advantage that kept Leicester dreaming. It proved a glorious 2-1 aggregate defeat as they were applauded from the field. Shakespeare guided them to 12th place safety as Leicester City attempted to prove any doubters wrong. He would be gone by Halloween. Replacing him was Claude Puel, a man who many believe to be unfairly sacked from Southampton after registering an 8th place finish with the South Coast club. He recorded a return to the top half in 2018, only their 6th of the Premier League era. Puel's brand of football wasn't exciting, neither his public persona, and whilst he rode the us against the world narrative that Leicester suddenly adopted for themselves, he was disposed of in February 2019, with the club 12th. Some might say unfairly sacked once again. But the club wanted more from the ingredients they had. From Kasper Schmeichel in goal to Johnny Evans, Harry Maguire and Ben Chilwell in defence, Wilfred Ndidi stabilising the midfield behind the electricity that was James Maddison, Harvey Barnes and Jamie Vardy. Puel suffered from not being Claudio Ranieri as Leicester City suffered through the devastating death of owner Vichai Sivadhanaprabha as he left the stadium via helicopter after a 1-1 draw against West Ham United in October 2018. Next to take on the mantle of restoring fairy tale to the King Power Stadium was Brendan Rodgers. He retreated from the precipice of a historic treble of trebles with Celtic and returned to his own unfinished business of Premier League football after nearly mounting a surprise of his own with Liverpool in 2014. He brought back joy to the King Power and made them an intense football team, as well as a perennial contender for Champions League football once again. Not since the days of the mid-2000s of Everton and Aston Villa had the royalty of the Premier League been gate-crashed for such a prolonged period of time. Brendan Rodgers' downfall was the botching of 2 subsequent final days, where the allure of the Champions League was cruelly transformed into the crippling mundanity of the Europa League. They were 10 points clear of 5th place when football ground to a halt thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. Their season collapsed upon the return of football and a defeat to Manchester United at home on the final day, which barred their booking at Europe's top table. Rodgers did deliver success though via a Yuri Tielemans winner in the 2021 FA Cup final over Chelsea, the soon-to-be European champions, and a club who would pip Leicester to Champions League qualification thanks in part to a win at Stamford Bridge 3 days after the final. Irrespective of hitting their head on the glass ceiling of the top 4, Brendan Rodgers had transformed Leicester from the plucky counter-attacking dilly-ding-dilly-dong of Claudio Ranieri to a more possession-based team. They took the game to the opposition thanks to a heavy blend of 3/8s and inside forwards that included James Maddison, Yuri Tielemans and Harvey Barnes. They had become the fashionable club who bought low, sold high and maintained their level, as Southampton had done before them and Brighton would do so afterwards. Between 2016 and 2020 they sold £255 million worth of players and turned over the title-winning team with an even better squad. Not only did they reinvest for the present and continually hit the jackpot, they had the foresight to plan opening a new training base at a cost of £100 million. From their promotion in 2014 to Project Restart in the summer of 2020, Leicester were comfortably the 7th best team in the land, so much so that people questioned whether or not it should be a Big 7. However, compounding the loss of their owner was the pandemic that heavily impacted the ownership's business, King Power. As King Power's turnover dwindled from £2.3 billion to £448 million, Leicester found themselves forced to stand still in the market, as others' spend went beyond them. A glut of injuries could be blamed during Project Restart in 2020. Their small squad blamed the following year before Wesley Fofana's injury at the start of Rodgers' 3rd full term impacted them greatly. Suddenly, the big, long contracts for younger players didn't seem like such a great idea. What was once a minnow's wage bill in the bottom 5 of the division was now comfortably another contributor as to why Leicester should be considered part of a Big 7. £122 million was spent on players' wages in 2019 before it ballooned to £182 million in 2022. Fine if it was manageable, but the club's wages to revenue ratio catastrophically rose to above 80%. All it took was one cycle of their buy low, sell high strategy to not pay off, and Leicester would be found out. And in 2023, despite the talents of Maddison and Tielemans who couldn't be sold and rejuvenated in a depressed market, Leicester returned to the Football League after 9 years away. And as we sit here 7 years after the impossible year of 2016, as Leicester seemingly are back on their way back to the big time, only Jamie Vardy and Mark Albrighton remain Leicester City players.